Morning everybody, welcome to another episode of Brave Men Died Here, and today we're in Yorkshire, not very far from the city of York. We're going to go back in time a few hundred years to the year of 1644, smack bang in the middle of the English Civil War, although as one historian once said, the English Civil War was neither English nor civil, often known to historians as the British Civil Wars or the War of Three Kingdoms. This particular battle is one of the largest battles of that civil war, one of the largest and bloodiest battles fought in England, and it certainly turned the tide of the English Civil War in favour of Parliament. And today we're at the Battle of Marston Moor. Okay, so this is the memorial on the battlefield of Marston Moor, erected by the Cromwell Society, I think in 1939 if I remember rightly, and then refurbished in the 1970s. It stands almost centre of the battlefield, not quite, but central enough, and it actually gives you quite a good viewpoint of the battlefield. We'll talk through that in a minute and you'll be able to see the various aspects of it. And just round the other side of it, by the field, they've got a little notice board which gives you a little layout of the battle, a little bit of a history behind it, some engravings there of some of the key characters who took part in the battle. So you can come and just have a little read up on this when you visit the battlefield. There's a lay-by just opposite where you can park up. It's not normally very busy, and then if you look in this direction here you get a really good view of the battlefield itself, and what we'll do in a moment is we'll actually look around this battlefield in a bit more detail and explain where everything happened. Okay, so we'll start our orientation of the battlefield by the memorial itself, the obelisk. The camera now is looking south. If we look in that direction, you'll hear a car coming in a minute. If you follow the road in that direction, it takes you to the city of York, which in 1644 had been under siege for a couple of months by parliamentarian forces. Three armies in total actually. The Army of the Eastern Association under the Earl of Manchester, the local northern parliamentarians under Lord Fairfax and his son, Sir Thomas Fairfax, and also besieged by a Scots Covenanter force which had come into the war on the side of Parliament. So that's York in that direction. If you look at this different direction here, you will be following the road down towards a village called Tockwith. And then beyond that it will take you to the town of Wetherby, and beyond that towards West Yorkshire. And just slightly right here, if we go across the fields there, if you've travelled in that direction you would cross the River Nid, and then it would take you towards Knaresborough and Harrogate. Now the situation in 1644 is that a relief force of royalists under Prince Rupert was on its way to relieve York, to lift the siege, and they were coming from this direction where the camera is now. Prince Rupert had actually started from Shrewsbury. He'd marched north through Lancashire, stripping out royalist garrisons and reinforcing his small army as he went. And it's believed that when he got here to York, he had about 14,000 troops with him, about 7,000 foot and about 7,000 horse. And a couple of days before the battle, the parliamentarians got wind that Rupert was at Knaresborough with the relief force. And so what they did is they came to occupy this high ground here behind us, this big long ridge which runs for about 1.5 miles between the villages of Long Marston and Tockwith, which is in that direction there. And the idea was that they would sit on that ridge with all their forces, and they would look out across this open ground, and when Rupert approached from Knaresborough towards York, they would see the royalist army coming and then be able to intercept him and engage him. However, Prince Rupert had a bit of a trick up his sleeve. What Rupert did is take his army across the Rivers Nid and the River Ouse, and he approached York by a circuitous route, miles and miles in that direction over there at the other side of the river, and came round to relieve York from the north. The parliamentarians, realising that the siege had been lifted, were pretty dispirited and realised that they probably couldn't capture the city anymore. And at that stage, the parliamentarian army began to withdraw from the area. So if we go back towards the ridge, up here on this ridge, on the morning of the 2nd of July, when the parliamentarians got wind that Rupert had reached York and relieved it, they started to pull away and disappear over that ridge there. If you head over that ridge and start to head southwards, you come to the town of Tadcaster. Tadcaster lies on the River Wharfe. There's an old medieval stone bridge over the river there, and the Parliamentarian army started to head back towards Tadcaster with the intention of heading south and leaving the York area. Not really in any mood for a fight at this point. Now, it was sort of mid-morning when the remaining Parliamentarian cavalry up on that ridge sighted Royalist troops approaching from the direction of York, and they suddenly realised that the Royalists were coming out for a fight, and so they had to send runners off, gallopers off, southwards over that ridge towards Tadcaster to call their army back. And that's exactly what they did. And the reason why they had to do that is because if we look back here again, having reached York from the north over there, Rupert announced to the Marquis of Newcastle, the commander of the Royalist garrison of York, that he was going to fight the Parliamentarian army. And when the Marquis of Newcastle said, well, what's the point? You've relieved York. Let's consolidate, let's wait for more reinforcements. The Parliamentarians will probably withdraw, and maybe even the three armies will split up, and we can then pursue them and attack them separately. Rupert produced a letter from his uncle, King Charles I, and this letter is infamous. It was written a couple of weeks before the battle, and it was so badly worded by the king that when Rupert read it, he just took it as an automatic order to seek out and fight the Parliamentarians regardless. And actually, one of the king's secretaries, when they read a copy of the letter after it had been sent to Rupert, he said, "By God, sir, you are undone. On this letter, or on the basis of this letter, he will fight come what may." So people realised the nature of Prince Rupert, his fiery temperament, his desire to engage in battle, that they realised that was his nature, and that when he received this really confusing letter from the king, that he would interpret it as an order to fight. And of course, at this stage, Rupert's army, combined with the Marquis of Newcastle's, was only about 20,000 strong. The combined armies of Parliament, including the Scots, were about 28,000 strong. And as you can see, if this is the direction of York that we're looking in now, the Royalist army came out of York across this open ground onto what was called then Hesse Moor, now Marston Moor, and the Parliamentarians were assembling up here on this high ground, on this ridge. So the Parliamentarians had the dominating feature for miles around. Okay, we'll just talk about the dispositions at the start of the battle then. We're looking southwards from the memorial up onto the ridge, and that small tree that you can see up on the top is often referred to as Cromwell's Clump. Named slightly incorrectly really, because Cromwell was at the far side of the battlefield, as you'll see in a moment, but as he becomes one of the most famous figures that fought here, it was perhaps inevitable that it would become known as that particular name. So the area of ground we're looking at now is the right flank of the Parliamentarian army. They would be facing towards us, and that right flank, as was traditional in 17th century orders of battle, would have been comprised almost entirely of cavalry and maybe a few musketeers. On the day of the battle, this particular flank was commanded by Sir Thomas Fairfax, the son of Lord Fairfax. The Fairfax family were northern Parliamentarians, and they'd been fighting against the Marquis of Newcastle and his northern Royalist forces for a couple of years. And on this particular occasion, Fairfax was over here with about 5,000 horse, cavalry, as we call them these days, up on that high ground there. If we pan along now across the centre, right along the lower slopes of this ridge, right down probably as far as this busy road in front of us, was the Parliamentarian centre. And again, as was traditional, this was comprised entirely of infantry, or the foot as they were known. Now, we believe that on the day of the battle, the Parliamentarian army was assembled in 4 lines, and we know that on the first line of troops and the third line of troops, there were troops from all 3 armies, the Scots, the Eastern Association and the Northern Parliamentarians. The second line, we think, were comprised entirely of Scots, and then there was a very small 4th line, which was reserves, probably some of Earl of Manchester's and also some of the Scots Covenanters. But they would have taken up all of that ridge as far as the eye can see, because it curves round slightly towards the village of Tockwith and Marston Grange in the far distance there. But that would have been where the Royalist centre was, and probably the majority of their guns as well. In the far distance, just over the ridge, probably a little bit out of sight of us, and we'll maybe go down there later and take a look, that's where the left wing of the parliamentarians were. Again, comprised of about 5,000 horse, and this contained probably the cream of the parliamentarian army, which was the Eastern Association Horse, or the Ironsides as they were known, commanded by Oliver Cromwell. So he was over at the far side of the field. Across the open ground then is where the Royalists began to assemble during the morning of the 2nd of July. We're looking directly at the Royalist centre, across the far side of these two cornfields, just at the other side of that hedgerow that you can see. That's where the Royalist army formed up. The Royalist infantry was primarily the infantry brought by Rupert with him on his march north, but it also, during the course of the day, was reinforced by infantry from the Northern Royalist army under the command of the Marquis of Newcastle. The problem was that following the relief of York, the Royalist infantry, having been cooped up in the city for a couple of months, went a little bit stir crazy and started to plunder the siege lines, got themselves a little bit drunk, and turned up rather late for the battle. And so they got sort of jammed in at the rear of the Royalist positions as they arrived. Again, mirroring the parliamentarian setup at the other side of this hedgerow here, and we'll have a look at that in a moment, on the left flank of the Royalists, and facing Fairfax's men with the Northern Cavalry of the Royalist army. This was commanded by Lord Goring, and it had a number of very notable people amongst it, such as Sir Charles Lucas and Marmaduke Langdale, veteran officers of the Royalist cavalry, very grim, dour, business-like people who liked a good fight. And they were over there on the left wing of the Royalist army with some commanded musketeers. Over on the far side, way in the distance there, again towards Tockwith, on the right wing of the Royalist army, was Rupert's regiment of horse, Lord Byron, and more Royalist cavalry, about 2,500 of them. And then right at the back of the army, in the distance there behind the infantry, was a reserve, which was Rupert's lifeguard and the Marquis of Newcastle's lifeguard. About 700 horse sat at the back of the infantry. So that's the layout. The great thing about Marston Moor is it's a very open battlefield, and you can pretty much see where everybody was from one vantage point. And as you can imagine, it would have been quite an impressive sight, both armies, perhaps totalling 50,000 men between the two of them, arrayed for battle on this big flat plain. Okay, so let's start talking about the battle itself. The battle actually was fairly short but very sharp, and it took place in the evening of the 2nd of July. The two armies had spent all day assembling, ready for battle, and by the time it got to early evening, around 4 o'clock, it became pretty much obvious to the Royalists, or so they thought, that the battle wouldn't happen until the next day, because the day was pretty much spent. And so sometime after early evening, the Royalists started to distribute provisions to the troops. They began to settle down and get ready for supper, with the intention of having a good night's sleep and getting up for battle the next day. However, the parliamentarians weren't going to let them have a night of rest before the fight. So what happened is, up here on the ridge, the parliamentarians are now completely assembled, and they took advantage of a brief thunderstorm that swept across the battlefield, a big downpour of rain, a big clap of thunder, and as that occurred, the entire parliamentarian army rolled down off that hill and just went into a flat charge down the hill and across the open ground here and straight towards the Royalists at the other side. Now, the story goes that the Marquis of Newcastle was actually in his coach lighting a pipe when all this happened, and had to jump out of his coach and quickly run to the front lines and start assembling his men. So the Royalists very hurriedly stood to arms and got ready to receive the parliamentarian charge. And this is where the battle got really confusing pretty quickly. So first of all, the parliamentarian infantry crossed this open ground here right in front of us. We stood right in the middle of the main infantry battle, across this open ground, and just at the far side of the field there, rolled into the Royalist line, which was covering off a kind of ditch with some hedges along the middle of the open ground there. And they immediately went into contact. Over on the far side, and we'll go and look at that later on, the cavalry clashed, Byron's cavalry against Cromwell's, and then over on this side, just the other side of the hedgerow, there was a clash between Fairfax's cavalry and the Northern Horse under Lord Goring, and we'll go and take a look at that in a moment. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is the battle on the right flank, if you like, of the Parliamentarian army. So we're just at the other side of that hedgerow that you saw earlier, and when the attack began, the Parliamentarians swept down the hill here and across the road and across this open ground towards the Royalist cavalry, which were assembled at the far side of the field there. Now, as Lord Fairfax and his men came down, they had to negotiate some difficult ground. Apparently the ground was quite broken here, but also as they approached the Royalist horse, they were shot at by some commanded musketeers which were on the flank of the Royalist horse. So that broke up a bit of the impetus of the Parliamentarian charge. And then at that point, the Northern Royalist horse under Goring and Lucas and Langdale countercharged into Fairfax. Now, even though the Royalist horse were smaller in numbers, they had a huge impact when they countercharged. And there was a very swift and very vicious fight, after which much of the Parliamentarian horse on this side broke and ran and withdrew back in that direction. Now, sadly, for the Royalists at least, what followed was fairly typical of many cavalry battles in the English Civil War, and much of the Royalist horse here were cock a hoop at having beaten the enemy back and pursued them and ran off the battlefield after them. Not all of them, of course. At least one small group of Northern Royalist horse rallied further up the field here, and if we look further up the hedgerow, down the bottom end of this field of crops to where you see the big bushy top trees in the distance, some of the Northern Royalist horse rallied there and then turned to attack the Parliamentarian infantry from their right flank as they were engaged with the Royalist infantry, which was just at the other side of this lane. So the first part of the battle on the right flank, really successful for the Royalists, completely dispersed the Parliamentarian cavalry, and now some of them turning to attack the Parliamentarian infantry. Sir Thomas Fairfax found himself stranded at the far side of that field behind the Royalist lines with all of his men dispersed, and legend has it that he ripped out the field sign from his hat, a piece of paper or something, to identify that it was a Parliamentarian, and then rode across the back of the battle through the Royalists to join up with the far side of the Parliamentarian army, because his own wing had been completely dispersed. So yeah, a very stiff but very brief fight here in this set of fields between two sets of cavalry. So we're back looking at the centre then. Across these fields here is where the main infantry battle happened, and it was really across the far side of the fields where the hedgerows are. We can't go down there because there aren't actually any public rights of way in this area, and it's all open farmland. So we've got to stand by the obelisk and really look at it from a distance. But when you think that the Parliamentarian army was 4 lines deep, most of this field would have been filled with Parliamentarian troops, regiments, all the way across as far as the eye can see over to the left. And most of the initial fighting would be along that far hedge line and where those 2 trees are in the corner of the field there. So that's where the initial contact point was. Now, what we know is that there was very mixed outcomes across the front line. In some areas of the battle, the Parliamentarian infantry hit home quite heavily against the Royalists and made them recoil slightly. In other parts of the line, the Royalists held on really well, particularly across in the far side, on the right-hand side of the Royalist line. But what we also know is that at this side here, the Royalist cavalry, having dispersed Fairfax's cavalry, came in from the right-hand side of the Parliamentarian line and hit them from the flank. Despite that, despite the shock of that flank attack, this Parliamentarian infantry here managed to hold on and hold steady. The crisis actually came in the far centre of the line, so about where you can see that middle hedgerow between these 2 cornfields, because at about that point, where the Royalist infantry were having the heaviest work against the Parliamentarians, the Marquis of Newcastle brought in his own reserve of gentlemen volunteers, mounted troopers, and they came through the centre of their own foot and smashed into the Parliamentarian infantry. And at that point, a small rout occurred. The centre of the Parliamentarian foot line just crumbled and began to pull back off the field. And at this stage, the battle was really reaching crisis point. Two of the Parliamentarian commanders thought that the battle was already lost. So Lord Fairfax, who'd seen his own son's wing of cavalry routed on the right-hand side, left the field thinking that they were beaten. And Lord Leven, the commander of the Scots, seeing his own infantry crumble in the centre, left the field thinking that the Royalists had the victory. But fortunately, the Earl of Manchester stayed on gamely and continued to fight with his own foot. And over on the far side, there was a slightly different story emerging, where Cromwell and the Ironsides had engaged with the Royalist cavalry and started to disperse them on the far side of the field. So actually, mixed fortunes across the battlefield. Over here on this side, it was all Royalist success. Over on the far side, the Parliamentarians were starting to get the upper hand. At this point, however, as I said, two of the Parliamentarian commanders, because they couldn't see what was happening on the far side, they just saw these two disasters at this end of the battlefield and assumed that the battle was lost and left the field with thousands of their men following them. Nevertheless, the battle raged on in the centre, and it became more and more confused as the time progressed. Okay, so we're now on the far side of the battlefield, the western edge of it. If you just look back behind me, in the far distance you can see the power line. You may have seen that on an earlier bit of the video. That's the far side of the battlefield where Fairfax's cavalry clashed with Lord Goring's cavalry. Beyond these hedgerows behind me, straight behind them where those bushy top trees are, for about a mile along there was the infantry battle. About a mile long. It's a large battlefield, very wide battlefield. But we're now over on the left-hand side of the Parliamentarian line, or the right-hand side of the Royalist line. If you look just up here on this very low ridge, just at the other side of the road there, you can see a small telegraph pole and a couple of shed roofs. Just up there on the lowest part of the ridge, that was the Parliamentarian left flank. That's where Cromwell's cavalry formed up, and David Leslie's Scottish cavalry. That's where they started the day. There were some man-made rabbit warrens on that hillside over there apparently back in the day, and they charged down from that low ridge across this field behind us in this direction towards Lord Byron's wing, which was over here with the Royalist cavalry. And so the cavalry clash on the right hand side literally happened in this field where we stood now, and maybe the field beyond it, and maybe one of the fields just over the other side of that hedgerow. But if you imagine you've got about 7,500 cavalry, 2,500 Royalist horse, 5,000 Parliamentarian horse, all milling around in this area, you can imagine what a chaotic melee it must have been. The story here was very different. Lord Byron mistimed his charge. It wasn't delivered particularly well, his countercharge, and therefore it didn't have sufficient impetus, and Cromwell's Ironsides essentially took them to pieces, assisted by the Scottish cavalry that were in the second line. Now, the story goes that Cromwell was wounded quite early on during this scuffle here, possibly by a musket ball or a pistol shot to the neck, and was off the battlefield for quite a bit of the time while the fight was going on here. But what we do know is that towards the end of this cavalry fight, most of the Royalist horse was dispersed quite quickly rearwards, and leaving the Parliamentarian cavalry in possession of this part of the field. The Parliamentarian cavalry, particularly the Ironsides, Cromwell's Ironsides, were very well disciplined, and having routed the Royalists, reformed here, ready to go again, and that was critical to the rest of the battle. Now at some point, Sir Thomas Fairfax came all the way along the back of the battlefield to join this group of horsemen here. At some point, Cromwell rejoined his own horsemen, and they appraised the situation, and they could see that in the centre there, the infantry battle was still raging, and it was by no means decided. And actually, in many cases, it looked as though the Royalists were winning. And this is where the turning point in the battle came, because the Parliamentarian horse rallied and then launched a very significant and concerted flank and rear attack against the Royalist infantry. So they charged directly across this field here into the flank of the Royalists, and yet more Parliamentarian cavalry came round the rear and smashed into the rear of the Royalist infantry. Yet more Parliamentarian cavalry went right along the back of the Royalist line and chased off that remaining Royalist horse was at the far side, menacing the Parliamentarian right. And at this stage, essentially, the Royalist infantry was abandoned on the field. Their cavalry had been completely dispersed. They had Parliamentarian infantry in front, Parliamentarian cavalry on all other three sides of them, completely surrounded. And at that point there, really, the battle collapsed for the Royalists. The Royalists attempted to make their way off the field. Very difficult to do, under contact, attack from all sides. But what we'll do in a minute is we'll go back to the far side of the battlefield and just show you where the final tragedy of this battle played out. Okay, so we're back here on the eastern side of the battlefield to talk about the closing stages of the battle. The battle itself was relatively short and sharp. I mean, the main fighting probably took place for about an hour, not much more than that, before the disaster over on the right-hand side of the Royalist line occurred. But actually there was still more fighting to be done, even when the main battle was over, because what happened in these fields behind us is one of the most legendary episodes of the battle. And this involves the Marquis of Newcastle's own regiment, the Whitecoats, often known as Newcastle's Lambs, and possibly a small brigade of green-coated infantry commanded by Henry Tillier. And what happened is when the Royalist centre collapsed and the Royalists began to flee the field, a small body of infantry, I say small, probably 2,000 or 3,000 strong, fought a rearguard action somewhere in these fields behind us. Now, the exact location has never been established. It's known in the history books as White Sykes Close, but you can't find that name on any modern maps. So we believe that it probably happened somewhere at the sort of rear left of the Royalist line, either along this hedgerow here, down towards where the Royalist start positions were, or slightly further across beyond the power lines towards that wood, because that takes you to a place called Atterwith Lane, and there are some fields there called Atterwith Enclosures. And what we know from the history books is that this body of Royalist infantry barricaded itself into some ditched and hedged enclosures in this part of the field. And the reason it was in this part of the field is because the Royalists were retreating in the direction of York, which was across the field there towards the village of Hesse, and then following the York Road into the city. And so the Royalist infantry put up this stubborn resistance here to try and hold off the Parliamentarian pursuit. And so the Royalist infantry, particularly the Northern Royalist infantry, the Whitecoats, that got some pretty unfair attention at the start of the battle about being late and being drunk and all the rest of it. Now they were here, they decided they were going to fight, and so they set themselves up there as a rear guard. Now the history books say that they were offered quarter, that the parliamentarians gave them the chance to surrender, but they refused and continued to fight on until they'd run out of all their powder and shot and had nothing left but their butts of their muskets and their pikes to fight with. And at that stage the parliamentarians started to take them to pieces with fire from dragoons and musketeers, and then finally broke into the enclosures and cut the remainder down. And so that entire body of Royalist infantry died almost to a man in that area that was known as White Sykes Close. And at that point, as dusk began to fall, that's when the battle comes to an end. So yeah, a final tragedy for the Royalists right at the end of the battle. In terms of the Marquis of Newcastle and Prince Rupert, they managed to get off the battlefield as far as York. There are some recriminations. The Marquis of Newcastle basically giving it a bit of "I told you so, we shouldn't have fought." Prince Rupert probably blaming all kinds of other people for the failure. What we know is that later that evening they parted ways. The Marquis of Newcastle eventually would take ship and go to the continent and go into exile, and Prince Rupert would take what was left of his cavalry and head off back towards the Yorkshire Dales, towards some Royalist strongholds there. And there ended the Battle of Marston Moor. They reckon the casualties were probably somewhere in the region of 4,000 to 6,000, predominantly on the Royalist side, because they took such heavy casualties during that fighting withdrawal off the field. But the main point is that essentially the north of England was lost to the king. Very shortly after this battle, York surrendered. It arranged terms with the parliamentarians, and the city was given up to them. And that meant that in the north of England, there were really just a few isolated garrisons, you know, in a couple of small towns, the odd castle, the odd stately home, that were in royalist hands. The rest of this part of the country had fallen to the parliamentarians. And really, this became the turning point of the war. After Marston Moor, there was no going back for the royalists. It was pretty much a case of being on the back foot all the way to the bitter end. And that concludes the Battle of Marston Moor. Right, well, that brings us to the end of another battlefield tour. I hope you enjoyed looking around Marston Moor. If you enjoyed the video, I'd be really grateful if you could press the like button, maybe even share it with a friend. And if you want to subscribe, please feel free to do so. And then you'll get updates and automatic notifications when I put a new video on. As ever, I like to leave a little token of respect on every battlefield that I visit. And today I picked some fresh poppies from my own garden, nice traditional English flowers, and I'm going to leave them here on the memorial which was put up by the Cromwell Society in memory of all those who fell at this memorable battle.